Now, Minister in the Presidency Khumbudzo Ntshavheni says that South Africa has various options apart from arresting Russian President Vladimir Putin should he set foot in the country. It follows an arrest warrant issued against him by the International Criminal Court over war crimes in the Ukraine. International relations expert Brooks Spector joins us for more on this. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, the South African government faces an enormous amount of pressure to make a decision on whether or not to execute this arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin for the alleged war crimes. In understanding the various legal options regarding the visit, what considerations will this interministerial committee have to make?
Well, I think good evening, first of all. I think the first thing we need to keep in mind is that when the Statute of Rome was initiated and the South Africans joined the International Criminal Court statute, they took an important step, and the adherence to the ICC rulings was domesticated into South African law. And what that means, of course, is that it became part of this country's legal structures. That meant that there really was no way to avoid dealing with it. And if you recall, a number of years ago, when we have to remember this man's name, Omar al-Bashir from Sudan was here for an AU summit. The government, even though there was an International Criminal Court warrant for his arrest, the government equivocated on it, and it went up the court system to the Constitutional Court, and the government was ordered to follow its own law, which it did not, because it allowed Bashir to leave the country before an arrest warrant could conceivably have been served. The challenge for South Africa now is that although there are these obvious technical and legal issues to be concerned with, there's also the other part of it, which is that allowing Vladimir Putin to have a starring role in a five-nation BRICS summit that takes place on South African soil also runs against the growing international opprobrium about the way in which the Russians have carried out their invasion of Ukraine. Now, we need to be clear that the ICC ruling is not in the general sense of, bad boy, you have invaded Ukraine and done terrible things. It was very specific and relatively narrowly focused, which was to say that it was about somewhere in the neighborhood, depending on which statistics you read, somewhere between 8,000 and 16,000 Ukrainian children, sometimes still infants, that have reportedly been abducted and taken into Russian-controlled territory or Russia proper. And that quite clearly is an illegal act, and by the court's definition then was therefore a crime against humanity, and therefore an arrest warrant was issued. And Vladimir Putin was not the only person so named. The country's Commissioner for Child Welfare, as the significant responsible authority on this, was also named, and so the two of them have these arrest warrants against them. What options do the South Africans have? Well, they could ignore the ruling and go ahead as if it hadn't happened and encourage Vladimir Putin to arrive and roll out that red carpet at the airport and say welcome, and the full thing that you do at airports for international visitors of that level. It could equivocate somehow and find some convenient excuse after negotiation quietly with the Russians. Maybe Mr. Putin will have a cold, maybe there'll be some national emergency he has to attend to, and so forth, that kind of thing. Or they can go ahead with his participation by virtual streaming, or even conceivably the participation of the Russian government by somebody other than Vladimir Putin, somebody who obviously is not named in an international criminal court ruling. The challenge is, no matter what South Africa does at this point on this, somebody will be particularly, or some country or countries will be particularly upset. The Russians may feel that their honor has been besmirched. A number of Western nations may feel the South Africans are even less likely to be honest, fruitful partners in international issues. Foreign businesses may well feel that this is simply one more reason, on top of all the other problems with electricity and so forth, not to invest at this point. And that, I think, even more than whether or not he can come or can't come, that really is the heart of the dilemma for the South African government.
Yes.
As a result, you had that mission that's going to the U.S., which is supposed to plead its case so that the South African government will not be hit with the possibility of revoking its status under the African Growth and Opportunity Act as it now stands, which would have a significant hit on the economy of this country, or even if the act was renewed in 2025, South Africa was eliminated from coverage in the first place. I don't envy the South African government having to wrestle with this multi-headed issue. I think that, unfortunately, it's a self-inflicted wound of a sort.
Yeah. So with this decision looming and the stakes obviously pretty high, South Africa facing this diplomatic and legal dilemma as a government, because we know South Africa is an ally of Russia, both bilaterally and through the joint membership of the BRICS bloc. We also heard Minister Naledi Pandor defending the country's friendship with Moscow amid the growing call to isolate Russia following the deadly invasion in Ukraine, describing Russia as an old historical friend. Does the ICC have to request that South Africa arrest Putin?
Well, they already have by issuing the warrant. There's one matter I want to clarify, at least from my perspective. The old historic ally issue. Russia was not an ally of South Africa or groups in South Africa. The old Soviet Union, the former country, provided assistance, and one major constituent part of that was what is now Russia, and a significant other major constituent part is what is now Ukraine. And I don't have the precise numbers in front of me, but a goodly chunk of the people who went to Russia, went to the Soviet Union for, training of various sorts, actually received their training in what is now Ukraine. Just as a note, would you rather be trained in Moscow in the winter or in Odessa on the Black Sea coast? I think the latter would be my choice.
Absolutely. So very lastly, could South Africa request the ICC to relieve it of the obligation to arrest Putin as one of the other options?
I think they could try, but I don't think the ICC would do it. And I think further that would only open them, the South Africans, to even more international criticism, because it would appear that they were, in effect, quote unquote, knuckling under to pressure from Russia. And I think that is, since the country's status as neutral in this particular conflict is already subject to enormous contestation, that would simply cement the criticism. And I really don't see an easy way around this, save for Mr. Putin staying in Russia for some crisis or some illness, and having Sergei Lavrov, the foreign secretary, or the deputy president, or participation online. And that would be embarrassing for the Russians, but it would, since South Africa is the host, it would make things a little less difficult. Keep in mind also, South Africa is supposed to be the host a little later on in the year for the AGOA summit. And that is going to be very awkward for the United States then, since AGOA is American law that allows access for products produced here, having South Africa hosting an AGOA summit just after this predicament will, I think, be very troublesome for the United States.
Wow. Very well. Thank you so much for that. South Africa certainly finds itself in a predicament. That was Brooke Spector, international relations expert there, speaking about the enormous amount of pressure South Africa faces to make a decision on whether or not Russian President Vladimir Putin will attend the BRICS summit here in South Africa.